By the time a military base is described as abandoned, the decision that made abandonment inevitable has usually already been made. Bases do not fail because they are suddenly overrun, cut off, or rendered unusable overnight, but because the systems that justify their continued existence are quietly altered while the site remains staffed, powered, and formally operational. The first thing that goes wrong is not infrastructure, security, or morale, but priority. A base that once sat near the center of planning cycles begins to drift outward, receiving fewer resources, less attention, and lower urgency, even though no official announcement has been made. On paper, the base still exists in the same role, but in practice, it is no longer treated as something that must be preserved at all costs. This shift is subtle enough to avoid resistance, yet decisive enough to shape every choice that follows. Once priority is reduced, logistical behavior changes immediately, even if the outward appearance of the base does not. Spare parts that once arrived on schedule, delayed, or substituted. Maintenance cycles stretch beyond their original intervals, and temporary fixes are allowed to persist because they are sufficient for a base that is no longer expected to perform at peak capability. Power generation systems are run closer to minimum acceptable output. Redundancy is preserved only on the paper, and non-critical infrastructure is quietly sidelined to conserve resources. The base continues to function, but only just, and only because the definition of acceptable performance has already begun to shrink. These changes are not driven by neglect, but by deliberate recalibration, because a base that still works can continue to serve strategic purposes even if it is no longer worth fully sustaining. As this recalibration continues, maintenance shifts from preventive to reactive, without anyone formally announcing the change. Systems are no longer serviced to prevent failure, but to respond when failure occurs. This saves time and resources in the short term, while increasing fragility in the long term. Equipment that would once have been rotated out for refurbishment is kept in service longer, and specialized teams are reassigned elsewhere because their expertise is needed more urgently at higher priority locations. The base does not immediately suffer visible consequences from this shift, which reinforces the belief that the changes are safe. In reality, the margin that once allowed the base to absorb disruption is being steadily eroded. Over time, personnel experience this change not as abandonment, but as stagnation. Training schedules become irregular, exercises are scaled back, and career progression slows for those assigned to the base. Experienced staff request transfers, while replacements arrive with less specialization and shorter expected postings. Knowledge continuity suffers, and informal workarounds replace institutional memory. None of this prevents the base from operating day to day, but it weakens its ability to respond to unexpected challenges. The base becomes dependent on routines that only function under stable conditions, even though instability is precisely what military infrastructure is designed to withstand. At the same time, reporting structures adapt to the new reality without explicitly acknowledging it. Performance metrics are adjusted to reflect reduced activity, and success is measured against narrower objectives that are easier to meet with fewer resources. This creates the appearance of stability while masking decline. From higher headquarters, the base appears quiet but functional, efficient rather than degraded. The absence of the visible crises becomes evidence that the site no longer requires close attention, and this feedback loop accelerates the loss of priority because resources flow toward locations that generate problems, not toward those that are quietly hollowing out. As operational tempo decreases, systems that rely on constant use begin to degrade in ways that are difficult to detect until recovery is no longer feasible. Mechanical components seize, seals dry out, and electronic systems age poorly when left powered but underutilized. Infrastructure designed for continuous load behaves unpredictably when cycled intermittently. These effects are subtle and cumulative, and they rarely trigger immediate alarms. When problems do occur, they are treated as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of systemic decline, reinforcing the belief that the base can be sustained indefinitely at reduced capacity. Strategically, the base begins to serve a different purpose without anyone stating it explicitly. Rather than being a platform for operations, it becomes a placeholder, a symbol of presence, or a bargaining chip in broader negotiations. Its continued existence allows planners to claim coverage, flexibility, or influence without committing the resources required to make those claims meaningful. From a distance, the base still counts. Up close, it no longer matters in the way it once did. This transformation is often intentional, because closing a base is politically and strategically expensive, while letting it fade quietly avoids confrontation. As months or years pass, the cost of restoring full capability grows faster than the perceived value of doing so. Deferred maintenance accumulates, expertise disperses, and infrastructure ages beyond economical repair. Even if funding was suddenly restored, the base could not easily return to its previous role without substantial reinvestment. This is the moment when abandonment becomes irreversible. Not because the base is unusable, but because recovery no longer makes sense. The decision has effectively been made without ever being formally recorded. As the base settles into its reduced role, the effects of prolonged underinvestment begin to compound in ways that are difficult to reverse. Systems that were once supported by overlapping layers of redundancy now depend on single points of failure that are tolerated only because they have not yet failed. Power distribution networks lose flexibility, communication systems become brittle, and environmental controls are run at minimum acceptable levels to conserve resources. Each compromise appears rational in isolation, but together they reshape the base into an installation that can function only under ideal conditions. Any deviation from routine, whether caused by weather, technical fault, or operational demand, now carries consequences that the base is no longer equipped to absorb. Decision-making at higher levels adapts to this reality without explicitly acknowledging it. Planners assume that the base will not be tasked with critical operations because its recent history suggests limited capability. This assumption reduces demand, which in turn justifies continued low investment. The base becomes trapped in a self-reinforcing cycle where reduced expectations lead to reduced resources, and reduced resources further lower expectations. No single decision creates this outcome. It emerges organically from a system that prioritizes efficiency and flexibility over preservation of declining assets. If you find this kind of long-form analysis useful, subscribing helps the channel continue producing videos like this. As this cycle continues, the administrative identity of the base begins to diverge from its physical reality. On organizational charts, it remains active. In planning documents, it is still listed as available. In practice, it exists in a gray zone where it is neither fully operational nor formally decommissioned. This ambiguity is useful because it allows leaders to delay difficult decisions while preserving options. The base can still be cited as a presence, a fallback, or a contingency, even though its actual ability to perform those roles is steadily diminishing. Over time, the base's remaining personnel adapt to this ambiguity by redefining their own expectations. Rather than preparing for demanding operational scenarios, they focus on maintaining order, complying with administrative requirements, and keeping essential systems running. Initiative declines not because of apathy, but because initiative is no longer rewarded. The base's mission becomes survival rather than effectiveness. This shift is subtle, but it marks a profound change in institutional culture that further distances the base from its original purpose. The longer this state persists, the more expensive recovery becomes. Infrastructure deteriorates in ways that are not immediately visible, such as corrosion within sealed systems, degradation of buried utilities, and obsolescence of control software that is no longer supported. Documentation falls out of date as experienced staff leave and replacements cycle through quickly. When assessments are eventually conducted to evaluate the feasibility of restoration, the findings often reveal that bringing the base back to full capability would require investment comparable to building a new installation elsewhere. At that point, restoration ceases to be a realistic option. This realization rarely arrives as a single decisive moment. Instead, it emerges gradually through a series of assessments, cost comparisons, and strategic reviews that all point in the same direction. Each review stops short of recommending immediate closure, but collectively, they establish that continued operation offers diminishing returns. The base remains open, not because it is valuable, but because closing it would require political, logistical, and symbolic costs that decision-makers are reluctant to absorb all at once. Eventually, an external trigger provides the opportunity to formalize what has already been decided. This trigger may be a budget adjustment, a strategic realignment, a treaty obligation, or the availability of a newer facility that renders the old base redundant. When closure is announced, it is often framed as a response to new circumstances rather than the culmination of a long decline. To observers, the decision appears sudden. To those familiar with the base's history, it is simply the final administrative step in a process that began years earlier. When the base is finally vacated, its physical condition often surprises outsiders. Buildings remain intact, roads are passable, and equipment may still be present. This fuels the perception that the base was abandoned prematurely or unnecessarily. In reality, the visible state of the infrastructure conceals the deeper reasons abandonment was inevitable. The systems that made the base viable have already been dismantled through neglect, redefinition, and dispersal. What remains is a shell that no longer justifies the cost of revival. The lesson is not that military bases are abandoned carelessly or without planning. On the contrary, abandonment is usually the result of prolonged deliberation and incremental adjustment. The first thing that goes wrong is not a dramatic failure, but the quiet decision to stop treating the base as something that must be preserved. Once that decision is made, every subsequent choice reinforces the same trajectory. Even if no one ever states the outcome aloud, by the time abandonment becomes visible, it is no longer preventable.